Pablo Escobar ruled the streets of Medellin with a heavy hand that changed the history of his entire nation forever. He built a private empire using endless amounts of white powder and blood to keep the local people in fear. The world watched in shock as one man became more powerful than the government, and the police combined together daily. He sat in his luxury office and controlled the flow of money like a king who owned every single street. Thousands of workers followed his orders without asking questions, because they knew the price of failure was usually certain death. Police officers often looked away when his trucks passed, because they preferred a bag of gold over a silver bullet. The silence in the city was heavy with the weight of secrets that everyone knew but nobody dared to speak. Every brick in his massive mansion was paid for by the tears and the suffering of those who opposed him. People believed he was the ultimate villain of the century, but the reality was much more complex than they thought. And Escobar was just one version of something much bigger that was operating in the dark corners of the world. Wealth grew until he had more cash than he could actually count or hide in his many secret walls. He was not just a criminal, but the architect of a new system that replaced the law with raw power. Simple farmers became soldiers overnight, because the promise of wealth was much stronger than the fear of a cold jail. Every official who took a bribe became a small piece of a machine that worked for the cartel every day. He understood that true control comes from making people depend on you for their very survival and daily hot bread. The jungle-hidden labs produced a constant stream of wealth that flooded the global markets with pure white expensive poison. Private planes flew across the ocean, carrying the weight of a nation's future in the form of illegal plastic bags. This was not a random story of a lucky man, but a carefully planned system designed to survive for decades. He bought loyalty with a smile and a stack of bills, while his enemies vanished into the thick green jungle. The foundation was set for a dark empire that would soon influence the politics of many different nations and people. The government tried to fight back, but they found that the rot was already deep inside their own high offices. Brave judges signed warrants in the morning only to find their names on a hit list by the late afternoon. Every time the police planned a surprise raid, the information was leaked to the cartel for a very high price. Radios buzzed with the sounds of static and betrayal as the soldiers walked into traps set by their own commanders. It was impossible to win a war when the enemy knew your next move before you even made the decision. Sometimes it was betrayal, and sometimes the system was failing on its own because of a total lack of vision. The streets became a battlefield where innocent people were caught between the crossfire of two very different and angry sides. Justice became a luxury that only the poor could dream about, while the rich paid for their own personal safety. The failure of the state was the greatest weapon that the drug lords ever used to maintain their iron grip. Nothing could stop the momentum of a machine that was fueled by the greed of the men who served it. Eventually, the king fell on a dusty roof, and the world celebrated the end of a dark and bloody era. Pictures of his lifeless body were printed in every newspaper to show that the monster was finally dead and gone. But the death of a man does not mean the death of the methods he used to build his empire. And if you think it ended with him, then you missed the real story of how power is actually maintained. Because what we saw was not the end. It was just one version of something that exists across the whole world. Different countries, different names, but the same system of control that relies on fear and the exchange of dirty money. the ghost of the cartel still haunts the mountain paths, where the ghosts of the past continue to whisper secrets. The machinery of crime simply found new leaders who were smarter and more quiet than the men who came before. We must look beyond the face of one man to see the structure that remains standing after the smoke clears. The blueprint for organized power was written long ago in a different land by men who understood human greed perfectly. In the sun-drenched hills of Sicily, a different kind of organization was born from the soil of an old tradition. The Cosa Nostra created the original blueprint for how a shadow government should operate inside a modern and civil society. They did not just use violence, but they used a code of silence that was stronger than any legal oath. Every member was part of a family that demanded absolute loyalty in exchange for protection and a sense of belonging. They built their power slowly by fixing local problems that the actual government was too busy or too weak to solve. A handshake in a small cafe was more binding than a legal contract signed in a fancy court of law. They moved into the shadows of the city and took control of the docks and the markets with quiet efficiency. This was organized crime in its purest form, where every move was calculated to ensure the survival of the group. They taught the world that true power does not need to shout when a simple whisper can get the job done. But even the oldest families must face the changing winds of time as new and more violent forces begin rising. Was the currency they used to buy the souls of men who felt forgotten by the modern world around them. A godfather would sit in his garden and decide the fate of his enemies while drinking wine with his grandsons. There was a terrible beauty in the way they controlled entire neighborhoods without ever firing a single loud gunshot. They were the masters of the long game who understood that patience is often more effective than a quick strike. Every favor granted was a debt that would eventually be collected with a heavy price that no one could refuse. The family was a fortress that kept the outside world away while they managed their business with an iron fist. Children grew up watching their fathers be honored by the community for their strength and their ability to provide help. Loyalty was not just a word, but a way of life that defined who lived and who died in silence. This silent power was a mirror of the society it lived in, and it grew stronger with every passing year. However far across the frozen plains of the East, a new and much more aggressive beast was waking up soon. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the sudden chaos created a vacuum that only the strongest and most brutal could fill. Former soldiers and intelligence officers found themselves without a job, but they still possessed the skills to wage a war. They took the ruins of a fallen empire and turned them into a playground for the new Russian criminal elite. Everything was for sale, from the heavy weapons in the warehouses to the oil that flowed under the cold ground. They did not care about the old traditions or the slow codes of honor that the Italians had used before. It was a race to the top where only the most ruthless could survive the freezing winters of the age. The streets of Moscow became a wild frontier where the law of the gun was the only law that mattered. Billionaires were made in a single night by stealing the wealth that belonged to the people of a broken nation. They spread their influence across the borders and into the hearts of the Western world with surprising and deadly speed. This was a new type of empire that used the tools of modern capitalism to hide its many dark crimes. Russian gangs moved with a speed that left the local authorities feeling confused and completely unable to react quickly. They used extreme violence as a first resort to send a clear message that they would never be stopped easily. While others preferred to negotiate, they chose to eliminate any obstacle that stood in the way of their rising profits. Their expansion was aggressive and reached into every corner of the global economy, from real estate to the digital world. They did not seek the approval of the local people, but instead they demanded absolute submission through the use of fear. The contrast with the old world was sharp, and the blood on the snow was a sign of the change. They built networks that were global and fluid, making it nearly impossible for any single nation to track them down. Technology became their newest weapon as they hacked into the systems that were supposed to keep the modern world safe. The world was changing, and the criminals were leading the way into a future where borders no longer really mattered. Yet in the East there was another way to manage the darkness with a level of discipline and strange order. Yakuza operated in the bright neon lights of Tokyo with a level of openness that shocked the outside world. They were not just a gang, but a semi-legitimate organization with offices and business cards and a public reputation. They walked the streets with pride, showing their colorful tattoos as a sign of their commitment to the group's rules. The structure was rigid and based on an ancient system of ranks that ensured everyone knew their place in life. They claimed to be the protectors of the poor and the keepers of the old ways in a changing land. The government tolerated their presence because they provided a sense of order that the police could not always maintain alone. They were involved in everything from the construction industry to the entertainment world, with deep and hidden roots of power. Every action was governed by a strict protocol that dictated how they should speak and how they should act daily. This was a different model of power, where the criminal was a part of the society rather than an outsider. The balance between the light and the dark was maintained through a complex dance of respect and also mutual benefit. Discipline was the core of their existence, and a single mistake could lead to a very painful and permanent ritual. They valued honor above their own lives, and they were willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of the organization. Internal rules were more important than the laws of the land, and they were enforced with a cold, surgical precision. A member would cut off his own finger to show his deep regret for failing to follow his master's orders. This level of devotion created a machine that was nearly impossible to break from the outside or the inside either. They moved through the corporate boardrooms with the same confidence they showed in the back alleys of the Red District. Their power was not just about the money, but about the influence they held over the hearts of their men. They were a reminder that even in the most modern societies, the old ways of power still have a place. The Yakuza showed that crime could be a profession with a history and a set of values that many respected. Now we must ask ourselves the most difficult question about the nature of these global systems of hidden human control. We have seen the different faces of power, from the jungles of Colombia to the bright streets of modern Japan. These organizations are not just groups of bad men, but they are complex systems that fill a human social need. Are they the villains who are destroying our world, or are they simply a reflection of our own hidden desires? They exist in every corner of the globe, because the demand for what they offer is never truly going away. We try to destroy them, but they always find a way to return in a new and much more dangerous form. The names of the leaders change, but the structure remains as a permanent part of our global and human history. Perhaps the system is not broken, but it is working exactly as it was designed by those in the shadows. We live in a world where the line between the law and the crime is often very thin and blurry. The truth is often more terrifying than the fiction we see on the screen in our warm and safe homes. Are these organizations controlling the world, or are they simply showing us how power really works in our modern lives?